Before we get started, we will do some prayers in that first, but I just wanted to, first of all, thank PNL for inviting me to come back for these Sundays in April. I was happy this could fit into my schedule with Geshe Tashi's visit having been canceled, which is unfortunate. But when I was working with Venerable Dundrup on coming up with what I'm going to do with these 4 Sundays, I looked over things that I've taught in the past and some that are more recent than others, but I decided on these topics because I think they're hopefully really relevant to you and what's going on in our country right now, as well as the world at large. Of course, these teachings are always relevant regardless of what's going on. But nonetheless, I hope that you will find them of use. Today, again, is on working with fear, which obviously is a very topical subject for us to be engaging in. The second one, which we'll do next Sunday, is called Making Kindness Your Religion, which is based on that phrase by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Judith wore her "Loving kindness is my religion" shirt, quote from the Dalai Lama. Doing some advertising for the... yeah. So again, that one will be kind of working with how do we work with kindness, especially in the midst of times that are trying and difficult for us. The third one is going to be a topic that I did back in San Francisco in October of last year before the election, called Bridging Our Differences, how we work with overcoming the divisiveness in our world. So I hope that you find that one of use in particular as well. And then the final topic that I'm doing at the end of the month is on making friends with ourselves. Now, as we work with all these things, we need to be sort of have a soft touch to make sure that we're not beating ourselves up too much, that we're really becoming our own best friend. So that's the idea behind what I'm offering to you these 4 Sundays. So I'm just really happy that everyone is here to partake of this, particularly today's talk on working with fear. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. She'll lead us in the prayers, I think. Yes, were you going to do that? Or is someone online leading? I wasn't sure. Okay. All right.
Taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. Once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki chognam la, jangchu bardu dagmi kyab suchi, dagi chunyen gepe sonam gi, drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Sangye chodang soki chognam la, jangchu bardu dagmi kyab suchi, dagi chonyen gepe sonam ki, drola penchir sangye drupar sho.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation then. It's always good to start with a little bit of time focusing our minds, letting go of whatever distractions we might have. So again, we're just going to spend the first few minutes meditating on the breath. I think all of you have a technique you use already with the breath, but if you need a suggestion, generally I suggest working with the sensation around the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale, as you exhale. Just always with us. We can use that as an object to focus the mind, to again, make the mind a bit more single-pointed. So whenever you see that the mind wanders away from the breath, then gently guide the mind back to the breath, letting go of whatever distracted you. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I will lead you in a short reflection, already beginning to explore this topic of how we work with fear, and then also to set our motivation for our time together today. So we can begin the meditation now. So now, with our minds a bit more focused, I'd like to invite you to do just a brief reflection on fear. And begin by just identifying the way that fear is operating in your life right now, the things that are bringing you some dread or apprehension, some worry. And if perhaps you're free of fear at this moment, that may be possible, well, then think in the past about how fear has operated. We're not trying to induce the feeling of fear, rather, just to bring to mind those occasions when fear has been more prominent in our minds. And maybe choose one or two of those to work with, maybe just one particular fear that you have right now or that was more powerful at some time in your life. And begin to investigate it by looking at kind of where does that come from? What is the source of that fear? And maybe don't be satisfied with the first answer. You might have to go deeper and say, but then where is that coming from? What is the source of that thought that is feeding my fear? And just do this kind of investigation to see if you can, in your own mind, begin to investigate the roots of fear, the sources of fear. Something we're going to be examining today. But I want you just to spend a few minutes in silence doing your own reflection on that, your own examination. Let go of that investigation and let's turn our attention towards generating our motivation for being here. So, the initial place that we're all coming from to some degree is to want to address our own fears, to be able to work with them more constructively, perhaps to even deconstruct them so that they are not so prevalent in our lives, because we ourselves will suffer less when we are not plagued by especially irrational fears, fears that cause us to and have difficulties in our lives and difficulties with others. There's nothing wrong with starting with that motivation, with simply wanting more peace in your own mind, less fear, less dread, less stress. But because we know that this is a universal emotion, can hold that perspective of wanting to be here for others as well. Perhaps we can become a source of greater peace and calm, a lessening of the fear in those around us. Holding that view of extending your motivation to be here for other beings as well, with the aim of eventually helping all beings to be free from everything that plagues our minds, not just the fear, but the anger, the jealousy, the pride, the ignorance, all of these that can be removed eventually in ourselves as well as in all beings. To try to hold that very vast view that you're here with this greater goal in mind, not just to experience some freedom from fear now, to experience the ultimate freedom, freedom from all that afflicts the mind, and to be able to bring sentient beings to that same state. You can open your eyes fully then, and we'll begin the class. So again, I want to welcome everyone, especially those of you who might be new to the center or to Buddhism. I don't know if I didn't get a chance to meet everyone beforehand who may be new here today, but so this topic again is very important for us to be having some sort of tools to work with, because fear, as I mentioned in the motivation, is a pretty universal emotion that we all go through. I might mention that one of the times I did this talk, the very first time I did this talk was here in San Francisco at the Santa Fe Vipassana Sangha. I was invited by one of the board members there to do a talk on fear, which is something that actually we don't really talk about that much in Buddhist traditions. I don't know. There's a few books out there that I've cited in putting my talk together today. But I did that talk many years ago, and I think I did it again almost exactly 5 years ago. Remember what happened 5 years ago? Anyone? Did you forget already? March 29th, 2020, I gave this talk for TNL students, all of you online, because we weren't meeting in person at that time. And of course, I started with a few quotes from Venerable Rabina, who many of you know. Venerable Rabina had just done a talk not too long before that, where she was working with this idea of coronavirus. And I think her talk was called, yeah, Coronavirus is Bad Enough. Why have fear as well? And I'm going to share a little bit about what she said, because again, I'm not wanting to go back 5 years, but I think it's still very, very relevant. It seems that there's nowhere on the planet right now that isn't suffering from the presence of the coronavirus and its consequences. But of course, that is not necessarily the prominent thing, but we certainly have a lot of other things that have replaced it. And it's bringing so much fear and anxiety, she said. And then she went on to say, this is natural, of course, but that doesn't mean we should take fear for granted. We shouldn't fall into the trap of believing that because fear is natural, we can't change it. This is the whole thing, of course, that the Buddha is teaching, is that we don't have to just allow these states of mind to be prominent and present in our minds. We can simply look at them and do something different. We can change our minds. He says, of course we can change. That's the fundamental point that Buddha makes. That's the essence of his teachings and practice. Our mind is not set in stone. We can change it. As I said, this is really at the heart of all the Buddha's teachings. I've talked about mind on many, many occasions with all of you. The mind is not our brains, though our brains are affected by what we do with our mind. Our mind is a non-material phenomenon. It is the stream of consciousness, awareness that we're all working with. And that is the goal of Buddhist practice, to be able to change our minds to the greatest degree. But of course, everything that is arising in the mind to some degree becomes an opportunity for us to learn more about our minds and to be able to investigate things to see what we can actually discern from those states of mind arising. We can even learn from our delusions, our afflictions, the crazy states of mind that we have. I did a course not too long ago on kind of getting to know our minds, kind of understanding, as Venerable Rabina often puts it, all of our crazy roommates, all the things that bite up here in our head and are, bopping around and doing things, sometimes taking charge and running with the show. And we have to be able to be aware of who those all are. Well, fear is kind of interesting. Fear is not one of these that's set out in the traditional view of kind of Buddhist psychology. It's kind of interesting that it is missing from that list, because it's very prominent in our Buddhist practice nonetheless. And we will get into a little bit of kind of how we can divide fear into really two different camps. There is some level of fear that is actually a wholesome fear. It is good to have some fear around some things. Certainly, if you go back in the history of how we developed as beings on this planet, we needed some level of sort of trepidation or fear, or else we'd be dead on the Serengeti plains, right? We wouldn't have run away from what threatened our lives, right? You need to have some level of fear to things that are going on that cause you to respond in a different way, to change your behavior or whatever the case might be. I mean, many of us have this with our health. As you get older and you see things falling apart and your statistics go off the charts or whatever, that you need to change things. You need to be modifying your activity and your diet and everything else because of various things threatening your health. That's one way that fear can manifest in a wholesome way, to give us that information that we need to pay attention, that we need to actually do something different. And I'm not talking about that so much today. That's not, that is an important part of our practice, but nonetheless, that level of fear is something that I think is good to have. Now, I will go into it a little bit when we talk about some of the Buddhist teachings that we can work with in terms of whatever fear is arising. The other type of fear is a more neurotic fear. It's in line with all of the delusions, the neuroses that we do have, that are this fear can cause us to kind of run away from our reality and build up a whole view of things that is totally distorted, totally out of touch. That's where I'm going to mainly focus on. Again, I think some of what we have in our world is in that second category, is definitely fear that is perhaps more built on our imagination than it is on reality. Nonetheless, I don't want to ignore reality. So the way I'm going to structure today and kind of the main topics I want to go into, first is really look at this idea of what is fear. This is where we will talk a little bit about the differentiation of different types of fear, but really to understand where it comes from. And that's the second point, going more into a Buddhist view of that, kind of what are the driving states of mind that are underneath the surface. And if you did discern something from the little meditation we did, you'd be welcome to share that with us at that time. But the third one is to really look at what are the effects of fear, to really understand why we need to address it, particularly when it is more neurotic. And then how do we work with it? This is where the heart of the talk today is really to look at what teachings do we have in Buddhism that we can be using as a way of transforming that fear. As I said, every one of these crazy roommates that we have has something to teach us. Well, fear does have something to teach us. Even if it's irrational, it has something that it can point out to us and a way that we can work with it in regard to the teachings of the Buddha. And then finally, what does fearlessness look like? We talk about the Buddha being a fearless being, but maybe for us, we're not quite yet at the stage where we're as fearless as the Buddha. But what does that manifest like in our lives? So I have a couple of descriptions here of fear. One I think I got from more like an online dictionary or something, but they both have this idea of future orientation, a reaction to something that may happen in the future. And I'm not saying you can't have fear in the present moment. That's something that is threatening you in that moment, but it's usually an anticipation of future pain, as Tara Brach points out. Many of you have heard of Tara Brach, wonderful Tibetan Buddhist teacher. But she is kind of pointing out the fact that we are always looking to a future experience and having some level of trepidation, apprehension about what's going to happen down the way. So there is going to be an element of kind of conjuring up things that may not be in line with reality. If we look at various times in our lives where things have changed, go back 5 years when the coronavirus first hit, we were first all going through that. How do we adjust to this in our lives? What do we need to do to keep ourselves safe from that? All of that. We see that again, perhaps some of our fears were well grounded, but some of them may have been pretty irrational. There's always this idea of something in the future that is threatening the way that we are now. I think it's interesting, Pema Chodron, she cites in one of her teachings on fear, that there was a Time magazine article where they went and did research on fear among people. And they found that actually people had greater fear of uncertainty than they did of their own death. It's kind of interesting. If we look at 5 years ago, what were we doing? We were dealing with a lot of uncertainty, right? Not knowing what was going to happen. What are we dealing with right now? A lot of uncertainty. It's inducing a lot more fear because people don't like uncertainty. As a species, I think we really like things to be sort of reliable. We can count upon them. We can know that things are in place and that things are happening the way that we would like them to happen. But there is, of course, that's an illusion, right? We don't really have that certainty. Just times in our lives when perhaps it becomes more noticeable that that certainty is missing, that we're actually dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Even Pema Chodron, she wrote there's a collection of her teachings. It's called Uncomfortable, or Being Comfortable with Uncertainty. That's the phrase that she came up with. How do we get comfortable with uncertainty? That's a part of what we're looking at today, because so much of what comes up with fear is our discomfort with uncertainty. The fact that we really don't like having that variable of a future ahead of us. Chogyam Trungpa, in a wonderful little book called Smile at Fear, we're going to have a few quotes from him today that I'm going to talk about. He says, fear is nervousness. Fear is anxiety. Fear is a sense of inadequacy, a feeling that we may not be able to deal with the challenges of everyday life at all. We feel that life is overwhelming. Does this sound familiar to anybody in the room? When I revisited this in preparing for today's talk, I was like, again, the nature of fear hasn't changed. The situations that we are fearful of certainly do change from day to day, year to year, what have you. But I think we do have that feeling of kind of how do we contend with this? The fear of losing our ability to continue in a comfortable vein. And this was from an issue of Tricycle magazine back in fall of 2017, again, shortly into the current president's first term. Fear is a given. It is a fundamental part of life and consciousness. And while it may not feel good, fear is useful and necessary. In spiritual life, the problem with fear lies in whether we have the wisdom to respond well to it. So I'm just using those again as an entry point for us to be able to look at fear as something that we are going to some degree welcome in, not to make it like a permanent guest where it's totally taking over our minds and we can't do anything. And look at some of the effects of fear soon, because when we see what fear can do, it can often be really debilitating. But nonetheless, there's something we can learn from fear. It actually is pointing out some very, very precious things. And of course, that's revealed to some degree when we look at where fear comes from. How does it arise? So before I go into this, I do want to mention, that many of you, and if you're new to Buddhism, might not be familiar with this term afflictions or delusions. Certainly when we look at Western psychology takes some of these for granted as just being part of our human psyche, right? That there's no need to really eradicate them, just to keep them somewhat under control. I'll use the example of anger. If you go to a Western therapist and you say, I want to rid myself of all anger, well, they might say, well, I can help you to some degree, but I don't know that I can really get rid of all anger. And it's probably good to have a little bit of anger, right? And of course, when we're talking about anger here, we're talking about that more afflicted state that is problematic, where we're actually going to potentially cause harm to ourselves or others through the force of that state of mind. We're not talking about the sort of justifiable or righteous anger that was on display, with the hands-off protests yesterday, where people are voicing their concerns in protest of things that are harming beings. That's not what we're talking about as anger. We're talking about a state of mind where we become crazed and we are unable to think clearly, and we often do and say things that are really harmful. So when we start talking about Buddhist emotions, such as fear and so on, we have to put them in the context of things that are problematic for us to some degree. Again, so that's why I'm mainly focusing on when fear becomes problematic, when it is rooted in deeper, distorted states of mind, things that are not really seeing things accurately. That's another reason why we call these states of mind delusions. We don't use the word delusion maybe so much in our society these days, but to be deluded means to be not in touch with reality. Well, the Buddha says we are all not in touch with reality at a very deep level, but nonetheless, even how we're dealing with things in our everyday life is a bit out of touch with reality. So we're going to be looking at this when we get to these causes of the afflictions, the causes of fear being rooted in the afflictions. And because we're mainly talking about the distorted view of fear that is not so helpful, not so healthy for us to have in our minds. So to begin with, the future pain that we are anticipating with fear is also an anticipation of loss, of our no longer experiencing the sense of comfort or security we've somehow gotten used to having. Once more, that's that uncertainty. We really do like to have things neatly placed out in our lives where we can count on everything. And if something goes out of whack, we don't want it to go out of whack too far, right? We can deal with small changes, we can deal with a little bit of adjustment, but we really are looking for things to be kind of status quo. However, sometimes this anticipation of future pain or loss of comfort can be useful. The fear that causes us to be more attentive to our actions due to not wanting unfavorable results. I talked about that earlier. This is really one way that fear is something good to have. If we have some fear of something that is potentially going to cause us harm or even others harm, we can begin to address it. We can do something about it. So that's where, again, just to reiterate, and I put this a little bit later in the series of slides here, we do have what we call a healthy or wholesome fear, and then an unhealthy or unwholesome fear. It's quite interesting. Freud, in his own approach to Western psychology, being the father of psychotherapy, he actually identified these two states of fear as well. They're defined a little bit differently. They're not quite identical to what Buddhism means, but he even called the second one neurotic fear, which is not a problem in Buddhism. We can say all of our afflicted states of mind are neuroses. They are things that are problematic for us that all need to be dealt with. So we're not going to once more be touching as much on the healthy or wholesome fear, because whatever fear we feel that is inducing us to act in the world, to do things that are positive, to try to address the causes of that, these are good things to engage in. There's nothing wrong with that. We should have some level of apprehension about things that are going on in our world that need to be addressed, right? If you didn't have any fear of the coronavirus, for example, and you just went about your daily business doing whatever, never masking up, never doing anything to protect yourself from it, well, then you would have been more likely to get it, right? You would, in the beginning, it was, a lot more dangerous than it is now when people get it. So again, we see that there is some usefulness to having some fear in our lives, something that if it's threatening us, we can address it and deal with it. But once more, the neurotic fear becomes problematic. So where does that sort of neurotic fear come from? In Buddhist terms, the elements of this process of unwholesome fear arising can be seen in terms of the three primary distorted states of mind. We call these the three poisons. If we look at the list again of what we call these afflictions or distorted states of mind, as I mentioned, fear is not on the list. In the traditional Buddhist psychology, there's a total of 51 mental factors, different things that the Buddha divided our mind into in terms of functional factors that do play a role in our experience, and a lot of them in our spiritual path. And once more, fear does play a role in our spiritual path. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this unwholesome sense of fear isn't really on the list. It's not something that we identify as something we need to address. So it must be coming in some way from these three root kind of poisons. These are the three things that poison our minds, and most of you are familiar with these. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I've got a slide for each. The one that the Buddha identified that's most involved as kind of our default mode is that mind of attachment or craving. That was already brought up in terms of what I mentioned earlier, that we have a craving or a desire for everything to stay kind of in the status quo. We don't mind, again, a little bit of change if it's favorable change, right? If things keep getting better and improved upon, well, then there's nothing wrong with that. But when things change in an unhealthy way, where we have some pain or difficulty that we need to deal with, well, then we really get kind of bent out of shape, because we like certainty. We like that kind of things being in line with what we desire, with our own sense of craving and attachment. So that's a really fundamental thing that is constantly moving us in particular directions, is our attachment to needing things to be good, to be pleasant, to be wonderful, to be delightful. Again, the Buddha said that there is a fundamental desire for happiness that isn't to be kind of thrown out with all of this. That's the starting point for everything that the Buddha taught, was that we are all fundamentally desiring to find happiness, to avoid suffering. Yes, every one of you has that as your sort of underwriting motivation, what you do every day of your life. But the mind of attachment is going after things that do bring some pleasure, but it's doing so with a distorted state of mind. It's desiring those things, wanting to have them in our lives and not wanting to be separated from them. But it, moreover, is embellishing them, giving them more kind of deliciousness, delightfulness than what is actually there. This is why it's a delusion. It's not seeing how we relate to things in a correct way. What happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants, though, is the mind of anger, aversion, hatred, all these kinds of things that are negative. Because when we get what is unpleasant, that we exaggerate as well. We kind of make it into this huge thing that is unbearable. We cannot stand the fact that that is happening, and we might even lash out at others, verbally, hopefully not physically, but do things that are in response to that going on. So we vacillate during our day between these two things generally. We wake up and we kind of go, oh, how can I get these things? How can I have lots of attachment, delicious, delightful things in my life to make my life today a happy one? And then whenever these things come into play, the negative experiences, the stuff that threatens our sense of well-being and comfort, we tend to get a lot of aversion around that. We want to push that out of our experience. And so we're going through that every day, several times a day, kind of like a yo-yo, going up when all the pleasant stuff is there, going down when all the unpleasant stuff is there. So the way I see fear operating in regard to those two is that fear is primarily the response when we don't get what we want, right? It's an anticipation of future pain. Seems to be very much related to that side of the equation, the side that is about some experience that we are anticipating that can be imagined or can be exaggerated to some degree, but it is an aversion towards that, not wanting to have that happen. Again, to some degree, that may be useful, but in general, when it becomes diluted, we have a problem because we're going to end up doing things and saying things that we're going to regret. Where are those two rooted? When we talk about this mind of attachment, this mind of anger or aversion, they're rooted in the third poison. And the third poison is that really deep distortion that we have of reality. We are thinking things have the concrete reality to them that isn't there at all. And the main thing that we do that with is this sense of I, this self that we adhere to so strongly. We think there's this real concrete person here. And we get into, we'll talk about that in a moment, the teachings that undermine that, we come to see that there isn't that substantial person there at all. That person doesn't exist. We are rotating around this axis of this concrete person that is a total fiction. It doesn't exist at all. So this is the problem. We kind of have that as our pillar in the middle of everything, and we relate to everything in terms of how it satisfies or threatens that sense of self, that person that once more we're so strongly caught up in, that we believe is real. So again, there is some reality to this self. I'm not going to totally throw the self into the trash can. It doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. But nonetheless, the way that we think it exists is what's causing all of our problems. So let me go through the slides and we'll see some words on the screen that elucidate what I just talked about. Our default mode, once more, is to come from the mind of attachment with a fundamental desire that wants things to be exactly how we like them to be. This is again often called craving, desire. It is the mind that is wanting the pleasant things in our lives, wanting it all to be a beautiful, wonderful world, with everything pleasing to us. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with the higher view of what that means to have all beings attain some ultimate state of happiness. But what this is driving for us towards is to really just achieve these very temporary, fleeting experiences of happiness that are not ultimately satisfying. Of course, this is one of the main truths that the Buddha taught right from the beginning, was the unsatisfactory nature of all of those pleasurable things that we do experience. It's obvious the unsatisfactory nature of painful things we experience, but even the pleasant things we experience don't really last. And look at all the joy, the happiness, the pleasures we've had from especially our sensory experiences throughout our entire life. And all of those are just memories now, right? There's no real lasting happiness or peace from any of those. If we've had a mind of attachment grabbing at them, we've only induced more kind of discord in our mind. We've only made our minds more agitated because we're constantly in that kind of junky mode. I share that with people frequently. What Venerable Rabina often says, that we're like junkies born into a world of junk. Everything around us brings us some measure of pleasure. If it's not bringing us pain, we're like grasping at all these pleasurable things, trying to get all those experiences. And we're like a junkie. We basically have the fundamental delusion that being an addict is based upon, that mind of craving or desire that is constantly going after all those things. Well, the biggest problem with them is that they don't satisfy. How many times have we gone to a particular dessert or restaurant for a meal that we like, and we've never been ultimately satisfied? We keep having to go back to those things again and again and again. Just the nature of those objects. They don't ultimately satisfy. So again, wishing for something that is a deeper state of peace, which the Buddha says we can attain when we've removed all of these, there's nothing problematic with that. That desire or that aspiration is a healthy one. But the mind of attachment isn't after that. It's after those fleeting experiences. It wants to continue to have that in our lives and is not satisfied unless we get those in our lives. And of course, it becomes dissatisfied when we get the opposite. That's the second one. Again, often called aversion. It's kind of a strange word. One teacher said that there was something you have towards vegetables that you don't like. But we can see how aversion is that it's that bristly feeling we get whenever we come into contact with something that induces that unpleasant sensation. That's really all that's happening, is an unpleasant sensation. But the mind of anger is feeling threatened by that. It says then a threat, whether real or imagined, to that sense of security appears. And we react with aversion to the possibility that we might lose that and experience something painful or difficult. This is where I see fear playing the most prominent role again. It's very close to this because it is looking at, once more, the starting point is that attachment to the status quo, attachment to things being the way we want them to be. And then the minute that there's a threat to that, we immediately go into this strong, negative state of mind and aversion energy, which, once more, I'm not saying that there's nothing wrong, that there's not saying that there's something wrong with having a healthy aversion to what's going on in our world and in our lives, where we can do something about those things and put energy into that. These two states of mind aren't about that, though. These two states of mind, especially the mind of anger or aversion, is about creating more negativity in our minds, becoming more and more disgusted at people or objects, things that are doing things that we see as harming us. And then, once more, reacting really quite negatively to those, saying things, doing things that are harmful, that don't create the result we're ultimately seeking for. They're antithetical to that. What we are ideally looking for is a peace that is attained only when we're free of those states of mind. If we're going to continue to agitate our minds with this cycle of getting what we want, grasping at it, and then getting, anxious and upset whenever anything threatens that, well, we're going to simply keep playing that pattern out. And that's the pattern the Buddha says that has gotten us into all the trouble that we're in. So we have to look then again, where do those two things come from? That's the third poison, the sort of root of all of them, the mother of all of them, if you will. Ignorance plays a fundamental role. And this can be seen more specifically with regard to one main fact of existence about which we have confusion, which once more is that sense of a self, the I, that all of this is revolving around. Okay? At the root of all our delusions is what's called self-grasping, the ignorance that mistakenly holds the I to exist independently, inherently, from its own side, substantially, objectively. There's all different words to describe it. It's that feeling that there's essentially a real I here, an I that is able to set itself up, which is in contrast, as it says there, to how it actually exists. I hate to be throwing all these kind of deep end teachings on you, but when we start talking, we start talking about fear, we have to really go at, well, where is it really rooted? It's all rooted in this mistaken sense of an I, this mistaken sense of the self. Because this is what we're ultimately trying to protect, is this feeling of an I that we think is real here. So let's talk about, I want to talk briefly about how the I really exists so that we don't fall into some sort of nihilistic thought around this. I'm not saying you don't exist. Every one of you exists. You wouldn't be here listening to this teaching if you didn't exist, right? So don't think that you don't exist. What doesn't exist is this fake sense of this, and Lama Zopa would always say, the real I, the real I. Well, that's because that's how we see the I. It's not meaning that there is no reality to the I at all. So how does the I have reality? I mean, the deepest way, I don't want to go through all the teachings on dependent arising, but the deepest way that the Buddha talked about the I arising, coming into existence, is in dependence upon simply a thought, a designation of I to this collection of stuff. Each of you has your collection of stuff, right? It's sitting on the chair or cushion right now. Your collection of stuff consists of two main things. It consists of your body. Very easy to identify that, right? It's the physicality that we have, all these different parts and what have you. And it consists of your mind. Your mind is not material, as I said earlier. It is a stream of consciousness that happens to be together with this collection of physical matter in this life. And it goes on to another existence after this life, the Buddha says. Because consciousness has its own continuity. It came from a previous life, which came from a previous life, which came from a previous life. There's no beginning to the lives that we've had. And there's no end to consciousness going forward, but of course we can change our experiences of what we go through with that consciousness depending upon what we do with our minds. We can have good experiences of being embodied as like a human being like this or what have you, but you can be free of all of that once and for all. You can attain the freedom that comes when you've uprooted that grasping at this sense of self. So when we go back to how does the I really exist? The I exists as nothing more than a label, a designation we give to this collection of stuff. There's a thought of I that each of you has in relation to this mind and body, but there's nothing more than that. Excuse me. Raven and I are both going through some throat stuff at the same time, some synchronicity there. So again, there is nothing more than the thought of I. I mean, there is a basis for the I too, right? I mean, we wouldn't say that there's no basis for that I. You can't just make up an I and say, oh, there's some person in the room that there's no basis for that person. There is a basis for that person, but that basis is not the real I. Where would you find it? If you could start looking for it, and that's the whole investigation that we go into in Tibetan Buddhism around examining the nature of this I, trying to undermine our grasping at that real I, is to really try to find it. Now, where is it in this collection of the body? Am I my body? Well, if you're your body, well, where does the mind fit into that, right? You can't be just the body. But we have an idea of it being kind of a singular I, right? It's I, it's a unitary phenomenon. Well, I got to find something that is equivalent to it. Is it the body? Once more, it doesn't seem like it's solely the body, though we do identify people on the basis of their physical body, right? But let's set aside the body for a moment. Can it be the mind? That second phenomenon that is here on the cushion. Well, if it's just the mind, then why do we have such a strong sense of an I in relation to the body? Again, we can't isolate any part of it, the mind or the body, as being the real I. The way that I exist is really just being imputed, being designated on this basis. That's it. It's enough for existence. It's sufficient. It's way less than what we think it is. We think there's something real here that we are defending all the time, that we are trying to get what it wants through that mind of attachment, avoid what is painful for it through the mind of aversion. And of course, fear is this kind of operating principle throughout a lot of this. Let me share with you what Venerable Rabina went on to say when she was talking about these three delusions. There's a lot more quotes I could certainly share from her talk that were really quite on the spot. But she says, so where does fear fit into all of this with regard to these three poisons? Interestingly, as I said earlier, it has no status of its own in the list of neurotic states of mind, simply because fear, in her estimation, is the flavor, the character, the energy, the very nature of all of them. And there's a lot of logic to this. That fear is kind of that force that is revolving once more around this central pillar of this real I, that we are relating to in such a distorted way the things around us because the fundamental premise is distorted. And so we do have a fear of that I not getting what it wants, having to face the things that are unpleasant, and so on. So she went on to say, they're rooted in fear. They are the voices of the main delusion, the main fantasy, the primordial grasping at a separate, concrete, set in stone me. Again, that's that fundamental ignorance, the third poison that is the root of all of our problems. We, through our own ignorance, set up this real sense of an I that we think is here without a doubt, self-established, independent, existing on its own. These are all the ways it's described. We have to get a flavor for it. You have to begin to investigate how that is operating in your life. And fear is a wonderful way to investigate it. When we have fear in our minds, it's because that is very prominent, this sense of an I that we are feeling as being threatened. Something is happening down the pike that is a danger to that I. And we are wanting to protect it, again, through that mind of anger, aversion. And that is the nature of fear. It is kind of embedded, as Venerable Rabina says, in all of these. I had never heard that point of view until I listened to her talk from 5 years ago. And it really is quite true. In my estimation, again, there's a strong linkage to that aversion or anger energy. But nonetheless, you can see how it is really the flavor of all of our distorted states of mind. Kind of this place that we come from where we just are really believing in this real I. We think if that doesn't exist, nothing exists. But the reality is it doesn't exist. And Nothing exists in this sort of independent way. Yet everything still exists in a very, very, very slight way. Lama Zopa Rinpoche used to say, it's almost as if the I doesn't exist. We have to go that far in our investigation and really get to that place where we go, wow, what's there is so subtle, so slight, but it's enough for existence. It's just nominal existence, things existing through being indicated, named, labeled, designated. That's it. That's what we do to everything in our world. We label these flower. I know there's a more specific name for them that I can't think of at this time, but we label this flower. There's no real flowerness from the side of these little petals out here. We label this thing a book. We all know what a book is. We learned what a book is when we were quite young. But really, book, once more, is a label that we're giving to a collection of things that have, a cover and a spine and pages. Of course, now you have ebooks where they have everything digitized, so you don't have all of those necessarily in terms of something physical that you can point to. Nonetheless, this is how everything exists, is that we are designating our whole world, organizing our whole world, which we need to do, right? I couldn't be talking to all of you if we didn't have organized thoughts around this is this, that is that, what have you. We need that. That's part of our language, is to give words to these concepts. But everything is really just conceptually existent. It's only being coming into existence by virtue of us designating. And the main thing that once more is merely designated, merely labeled, is the I, but we think it's much more real than that. We think it has greater reality. So as Venerable Rabina is pointing out, this is the fundamental crazy state that's like the worst roommate that we have, the primordial grasping. She calls it here a separate, concrete, set in stone me. And lots of different terms that we can use for this. The idea is it has some ability to kind of be standing on its own. But when we go looking for that, if it really did exist that way, we should be able to find it. You would think, become clearer when we go looking for it, but it actually becomes more and more elusive. Even from the Dhammapada, which is mainly studied in the Pali tradition, in the Theravadan tradition, there's a wonderful quote from the Buddha. Selfish attachment brings suffering. Selfish attachment brings fear. Be detached, and you will be free from suffering and fear. So, of course, everything the Buddha taught is how do we detach ourselves from that? How do we remove that fundamental cause that's behind and underneath all of our attachment, our anger, our fear, our jealousy, whatever, all of these states of mind that can become quite distorted, that are causing us to, again, have a lot more suffering than what we need to have. These states of mind inflict suffering upon us. And then, of course, our actions that follow. Now, how those operate in terms of our lives often can be seen by what I've taught on this a number of times, what are called the 8 worldly concerns. And I want to bring this up because then maybe I'll open it up to see what people had, any insights you had from the investigation we did in the meditation. But oftentimes fear is revolving around these. These are worldly concerns that are set out, as it says there, in 4 pairs. Those things that we kind of wish to attain, they're more in line with that attachment energy, and they're opposites, which we wish to avoid. And there we can see them as also a craving or a desire, because we're craving to not have those things in our lives, to avoid anything that brings any pain or suffering. In other words, kind of what the mind of fear is often about. Both of which, though, are grounded in self-grasping. Once more, any of the delusions, any of the afflictions, any of those crazy roommates in our mind, those are all being driven by the mind of self-cherishing. So I'm going to talk about these real quick, and then we'll just open it up to a little bit of discussion. And then I want to get into the real heart of the matter, which is how do we use these on our path? So first, there's the craving for kind of gain or material possessions. This is big in our world, right? Especially in the West. We have a lot of desire for things. And of course, we crave to not lack those or to lose those. You don't want anyone to take them away. You don't want them to break or to, be in any way damaged. The third and the fourth are the big one that drives us a lot of the time, are craving for happiness and comfort, and to be free from unhappiness and discomfort. Of course, this induces a lot of fear, right? Because we want to be comfortable. We want things to be, once more, our own way, the way that we are used to, the way that brings us that fleeting experience of pleasure or comfort. The fifth and the sixth is our craving for a good reputation and to avoid a bad one. This is big in many people's minds. They just want like to be well thought of, right? I want people to think good of me. I don't want people to think poorly of me. And there's some merit to that to some degree. Once more, the problem isn't these objects, it's the craving or the desire that we have around them. The fact that they become sources of heightening our delusions, heightening our afflictions. The seventh and the eighth, praise and criticism, these are, again, very operative in our lives. We love for people to say wonderful things about us, right? And then somebody criticizes us or blames us, points out our faults, and immediately, we can't deal with it. I think a lot of our fear revolves around these. When we really look at, we are once more driven to obtain those things that bring pleasure, the four that were all on the list that were more favorable, and we absolutely can't stand to get the other four. Right? And so because of this, we fall into this pattern of anytime anything threatens that, anything that comes into into our experience from those four categories, immediately becomes a source of some apprehension or dread, some desire to avoid it. And fear, of course, can be a part of that. So I was curious what other people found when you looked at kind of the sources of your fear in your own reflection. Anyone in the Gompa or online? If you are in the Gompa, we're asking you to kindly use the microphone so that those online can hear as well as it gets into the recording. But if you are online, if you'd like to do your little raised hand icon under the react sign down at the bottom of the screen, that would be useful. Yes, Dawn has something in the back. Thanks, Nancy. I'll take a drink of tea so I wet my mouth. I think it might need to be.
Thank you for teaching, Gen Don. Is it too simple to think that just like dualistic thought, which like I'm constantly, embroiled in, is sort of based in fear? Like, that I am here, you are there, and creating separation.
I think that's a part of it, definitely. I mean, especially when we get into the us and them kind of mentality that induces. I mean, there is a conventional self and a conventional others. We're not denying that those things don't exist as labels that we're putting on different elements of our experience, right? There's me and there's others. But when we embellish those again with a sense of the deeper distortion of there being a real other and a real me and the sense of complete separation from others and even conflict with others on the basis of others wanting what I have or not allowing me to have what I want, whatever, then that's the problem, the dualistic kind of mind that falls into place on the basis of that. So ultimately, there is no self-awareness because ultimately these cannot be found. I cannot find the self just like I cannot find others. But in a conventional way, yes, sure, self and others do still exist. But anything that goes beyond just them being merely labeled, merely designated, is going to be faulty. It's going to induce delusion. It's going to induce problems for us. So absolutely, when we're doing that kind of dualistic thought that is together with ignorance, then we're going to have problems. So I'm not wanting to get rid of like kind of just the fact that we can say there is self and other conventionally. That's not a problem. That's how we just construct again our world. But that construction of the world doesn't have anything beyond that. Anything over and above that that we're putting on that is going to be distorted. And that is an unhealthy form of kind of dualistic thought for sure. Does that help?
That helps. And sort of similar, do we kind of look for a beginning moment or cause either of the universe or our psychological problems, like based in a linear concept of time, whereas like is that also like I feel like grasping at the concept of time,
Yeah.
like versus like the ultimate reality of time.
I mean, ultimately, I think we again could say the same thing about time or about anything. Ultimately, there is no time, but time is a construct, and that is useful for us to deal with the reality of past, present, future, whatever. I mean, there is some construct to it. But nonetheless, yeah, we do have a lot of things that are time bound. And your question about, well, is there any point to kind of looking for where it all came from? I mean, certainly His Holiness has met with scientists who've been investigating where the universe arose from, right? And he sits down with them, and I don't think they're veering away from the Big Bang Theory a little bit, or I don't know. There's some change in some of their thinking around this, their theories. But when His Holiness was meeting with them and they said the Big Bang was the start of it all, he says, well, not a problem, but there's something before the Big Bang. There's another Big Bang or something that occurred before that. Buddhism is very much into causality. And if you get into causality, you see that there's always got to be something before what arose. Things don't come from nothing. Our consciousness doesn't come from nothing. The world doesn't come from nothing. It's all just a repackaging of things that existed before it. The previous moment giving rise to that next moment, and then something having happened before that, and before that, and before that. You can never find anything that arises on its own. Even just causality again speaks to the fact that things don't have any ability to set themselves up. They aren't self-established. They're established through causes and conditions. There's another level of dependent arising. It's not the final one that we want to kind of focus on, but it's a very relevant one. So there's not really a lot of point in going looking for the initial moment of ignorance, certainly, because there is no initial moment of ignorance, or the initial moment of consciousness, because there is no initial moment of consciousness. In this life, sure, we can say that consciousness joined up with the fertilized egg in the womb of your mother, and then that being began. That is known as dawn in this life, and that continues until the consciousness leaves the body at death, which is what I'm teaching on Tuesday nights, that whole process of death and rebirth. So essentially, the Buddha would say that to a particular being, there is bookends where that life began and where that life ends, but with consciousness, it goes through to future existences, to enlightenment, and it goes back without any beginning. So again, there's not really a lot of point in looking for the beginnings of things in that way. You kind of have to become more familiar with the idea of these are things that have been operating, but the most important thing is, how do I deal with them now? How do I actually work with it? They compare this sometimes to if you were in a burning house and somebody came in, you didn't know it, and somebody came in and said, well, the house is on fire. You wouldn't sit there and go, I wonder where the fire came from. You'd like, the investigation of where the fire came from is irrelevant. If the house is burning, get out of the house. So the Buddha is kind of telling us that we've been in a burning house for an awful long time and we should get the heck out. So looking for the cause of all of it isn't really the answer. Working with what the Buddha gives us as advice to move out of that is the answer. Any other comments on this from anybody? Yes, Tony, please.
Am I on? Okay. Two components, rather personal, current events, and the collective karma. Our collective karma.
Sure.
United States, what the United States has been propagating around the world for 125 years.
Sure.
The overthrow of numerous regimes. Are we entering a regime change here based on our collective karma for over a century? One question.
Okay, question. I don't know if I have quite the answer for that.
And the second thing is a comment about the Buddha Dharma and the preciousness of this practice. For 5 years, I was studying with Lama Alan Wallace, the Udamlinka's visitations, which were rather extraordinary. Alan translated from the Tibetan into English through Gatrol Rinpoche, who Alan was his main disciple. As you know, Alan was a disciple and translator for the Dalai Lama as well. Absolutely amazing course. I think it was like 48 weeks total.
Wow.
The last course was this time last year. All the courses ran from April 1st to May 30th. The actual Rinpoche died last year, April 7th. The very final teachings of this miraculous text that he brought forward to the world. So crazy and so wonderful. I got a text this morning from Tashi Choling, his place out in Oregon. Starts tomorrow. Register to attend April 7th, 14th, 2025 ECHO event to celebrate his parinirvana. Like I said, he died April 7th of last year.
Right.
His body did not begin to decompose until May 28th. Alan cut the class short by 1 day so he could get out to California for the sea burial of this amazing being. And Gacho loved sushi, so the instructions were to wrap him in cloth, take him out 12 miles beyond, and drop him in the ocean so he could feed the fishes. But uncorruptible for almost like 49 days. Interesting number in our practice. You know, he had to get here with the Dalai Lama and all the other amazing teachers that were chased out of Tibet. I wish I had 1/10,000 the non-fear that he had throughout this entire process.
Yeah,
But this is what the Buddha Dhamma gives us.
right.
I mean, we're in this fear, but nevertheless, it doesn't get better than this on this planet with these human beings. My particular take. So thanks, guys. That was long, and I'm sorry.
And to your question, I mean, thank you for sharing this story. You know, again, we do see the results if we do work with these teachings. I mean, look at the great masters. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a good example as well. I mean, they have a peace of mind and a calm that is not going to be disturbed in the face of whatever's going around, around them. To the first question that you asked, though, yeah, I mean, this is what we're talking about. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, every one of us who has some interest in Buddhism, I can't assume that every one of you is a Buddhist practitioner per se, or that you are committed at that level, but it's about making some sort of shift and change in consciousness and therefore in karma. I mean, where does karma come from? It comes from your consciousness, comes from your mind. So if we really want to, it goes back to that wonderful saying from Mahatma Gandhi, right? If you want to see change in the world, you have to be that change in the world. That is how we actually cause things to be different, is by us being different. You can't expect people out there to change the world for you. You have to change your own mind. So this is really what we're going to, let's go ahead and focus on for the remaining time that we have, the teachings that help us to kind of apply all this. I don't want to talk as much about the effects of fear. I'll leave these in the slides and I'll put those out there, give the link to Venerable Dundrup. You can have access to these slides. I want to talk more about how do we work with it, because that's really the gist of the talk today is, first of all, this is some advice from Thich Nhat Hanh in his book on fear. Invite fear in. mean, there is this resistance we have to fear when it's happening that can often be a source of more neuroses. But if we look at where that fear is coming from, the second point, assess what we are fearing and why, similar to the investigation I encourage you to do, really kind of say, well, where is that coming from? What is the source of that? And maybe not even once more be content with the first answer you get, but to say, then, but why is that? Where you go like deeper and deeper into your own personal investigation. This is what Lama Yeshe always encouraged, right? Was becoming our own therapist. We don't need someone else to ask the questions of us. We need to be our own therapist and actually investigate our own minds. Well, where is that thought coming from? But where is that thought coming from? And then, of course, to apply our understanding of Buddhist principles to transform our fear into the path. This, I hate to say it, the teachings are not that different than what we've looked at on many other occasions, even the course that I led here last December, where we looked at how to transform whatever we meet, especially adverse circumstances, into the path. This is one of the richest practices that the Buddha taught, was how we can actually use what is generally negative and debilitating and paralyzing for us into something that actually increases our practice of Buddhist teachings. So as Thich Nhat Hanh says in that first step, the first part of looking at our fear is just inviting it into our awareness without judgment. We just acknowledge gently that it is there. This brings a lot of relief already. It is kind of interesting how once we sort of treat it as somebody we're going to sit down and like invite them for tea, come into my room, fear, and tell me what's all going on with you. We have to be willing to kind of be with it. Sometimes I don't think we're even as aware of the role that fear is playing in our lives. But it's important to have this first step to actually look at it, to kind of bring it into our awareness so that we can then do a deeper investigation. Then, once our fear has calmed down, he says, we can embrace it tenderly and look deeply into its roots, its sources. Understanding the origins of our anxieties and fears will help us let go of them. So again, some people may find just that process is enough to reduce the fear in your mind, and may be very effective just at that level of kind of once more being your own therapist and looking at that. If you have some fear of some pain or suffering, His Holiness says, you should examine whether there is anything you can do about it. If you can, then there's no need to worry about it, right? If you cannot do anything, then there's also no need to worry. you know? It's kind of pointless at that stage. This is based on the wonderful teachings of Shantideva in his 6th chapter on patience of the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. This is how it's phrased by Stephen Batchelor's translation. He says, why be unhappy? But again, we could put in there, why be fearful? Why be anxious? Why be stressed? Why be worried about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being worried, stressed out, fearful if it cannot be remedied? I think this is really pretty basic advice, but it is so important. A lot of what we have in our lives is certainly things we can do something about. So if we are having fear, trepidation about what's going on with the government in this country at this time, with future anticipation of things that could come down the pike, well, then do something. You can do something. You're not totally, without any recourse, right? You can call people in Washington. You can get out and protest. You can, do lots of other letters and things that will raise awareness with other people who are in your community. Be sure that you are doing that because those things can have an effect. Absolutely. But there are some things in our lives that we can't do anything about. I hate to say it, but that's just the nature of our lives, right? We're going to die. Death is going to happen to every one of us. Some of those things we need to maybe get to a deeper place of acceptance. But moreover, once more, that doesn't mean that we can't learn from those things. You might not be able to change them, but you still can learn. We might not certainly be able to change the minds of people who are engaged in actions that are affecting us nationwide or worldwide, as it is. But we can do something to change our minds in response to that. And that really gets into the third point that I want to focus on again with the remaining time we have. If you can look deeply into your fear, Thich Nhat Hanh says, and have a clear vision of it, then you really can live a life that is worthwhile. You can see that fear is actually a great teacher for us. That's why I think Togam Trungpa's book was called Smile at Fear. He talks about how, you can be kind of delighted that fear is coming into your mind. That's how we should ideally be with all of our problems or difficulties. That's that technique of transforming what is unpleasant, suffering, difficulty, into something that becomes our greatest teacher. Something that goes, wow, there's a lot to learn when I look at that. So let's take a look at how we do that. Since Dharma, the word Dharma literally means that which holds or protects from suffering. It's kind of interesting. We use Dharma in a lot of different contexts, but that's the root meaning of it when we talk about it in terms of the Buddhist teachings. It's that which protects you from suffering. So the very first step when we are encountering anything that is bringing fear is to take heartfelt refuge in the Buddhist teachings. It is interesting how to be a Buddhist essentially means that you turn within. Even the word in Tibetan for a Buddhist is Nangpa. Nangpa means an inner being. We are not so concerned with the external. We're concerned with taking the teachings and applying them in our minds, changing our own minds. What's going on in the outside world, yes, we do need to have some attention to and concern with, and some movements of our own actions that help to address what's going on in our world. But the most important thing is to tend to our minds. So where is our real refuge? Our real refuge is in the teachings that apply to what we're doing in our minds, as opposed to anything that is outside of ourselves. Sometimes, once more, as Shantideva says, you can change the things outside of yourself. And that's okay to do that with an awareness, a consciousness that is not harming others and so on, that is having compassion. But nonetheless, the main work we always have to do is inside. So our real refuge is inside. It was one of the first thoughts I had when the pandemic broke. I was kind of like, well, this is just a reminder once more that our refuge is not outside of ourselves. Our refuge is not in the world at large and everything being the way we want it to be. Our refuge is in the Buddhist teachings that we can work on ourselves, change our own minds. So the more specific teachings that I think are really useful to apply during this time, or whenever we're dealing with fear, are the following. The first is to really be mindful of karma. Tony was talking about collective karma, but we of course also have our individual karma that plays a role in terms of our unique experiences, because obviously there are some people who are not going to be fazed by some of the things that we have fear about. But if our fear is arising, you can see the role that our karma plays in that. And then, of course, this concept of renunciation and of turning away once more from fixing the outside to fixing the inside. Let's look at that, and then we'll go on to the other ones. This is from some advice from the book I was holding up earlier when I was saying about this is a book that's merely labeled, a book called A Policy of Kindness. His Holiness was asked the question about how to work with deep fear. And his reply was, one way to work with deep fears is to think that the fear comes as a result of your own actions in the past. I mean, this sounds, for some people who are new to the concept of karma, it sounds like I'm wanting you to feel guilty about yourselves, feel horrible about yourselves, but that's not the case, right? Those of you who have been around the concept of karma and have some ability to work with it know that it's simply pointing out the fact that our experiences, just like everything else in our world, is a product of past causes and conditions. Everything we experience is a ripening of what we have done in the past. So once more, if we want a better future, we have to be attentive to what we're doing now. What we are experiencing now is the product of our past actions. What we will experience in the future will be the product of our current actions. It kind of puts the responsibility on our own shoulders. It's a way of acknowledging that we are the creators of our own experience. Nobody else is pulling the strings. And even with things going, to hell in a handbasket outside of ourselves, we still can develop our minds and create the causes for future happiness and well-being. In fact, those are the very times when we need to do that. Because once more, if what I'm experiencing now is the product of past actions, collectively or individually, that are inducing this fear in my mind, well, then I need to pay attention to that and say, how do I do something different so that I avoid that in the future, so that I create the causes for well-being and happiness? That's a limited view, because once more, that's still assuming that we're going to continue to be kind of embodied and having these experiences. We obviously want to do things that are going to take us beyond that, take us to a deeper state of being, with attaining liberation and so on. So that's where renunciation plays a role. If we see that what's going on outside of ourselves is a reminder of the unsatisfactory nature of what we call samsara, going from life to life, cyclic existence, well, then we develop a deep renunciation. There's nothing wrong with these. These things don't mean that you don't act in the world. They mean that you are doing the deeper spiritual work to be reminded of what we are here to accomplish, to initially address our own situation through these two main teachings on karma, and then, of course, renouncing samsara, moving away from that towards liberation. But once more, we're not alone. So, as His Holiness says, someone who is engaging in the bodhisattva practices, the Mahayana practices, seeks to take other suffering onto himself or herself. When you have fear, you can think, others have fear similar to this. May I take to myself all of their fears? He's alluding here to the practice that many of you know of called Tonglen, taking and giving. That is a practice of loving kindness and compassion that feeds into what's called bodhicitta, that motivation to become a Buddha for the sake of others. So fear can be an incredible touchstone to the fear of others and an opening to their suffering, opening to the fact that sentient beings are just like ourselves. All of us having that to deal with and having the conditioned existence whereby, again, there's uncertainty, things are going to happen, there's going to be pain, there's going to be difficulty. That's the nature of existence. Most sentient beings don't have a clue about how to work with that and how to overcome it eventually. It's the unfortunate thing, right? That's why we want to be as dedicated to our path and open our hearts to the suffering of others so that we can eventually help them in a much deeper way. But just the practice of opening to the reality of the fear and pain of others, because it's so easy to shut things off. I mean, look at, again, with what's going on. You know, we hear an occasional story about this person who ends up in the prison in El Salvador or whatever, based on the policies of this administration. And you can open for a moment to how horrible that must be for them, for their family, for everyone. But that's happening to many people, right? This isn't just this one person that you're happening to hear about. It's hard to open to the suffering of the world. And when we have our own fear about it, when we have our own concerns about it. But this is the most vital way that we can actually be in touch with the suffering of others and increase our compassionate wish to benefit them. You know, not being blind to all of that going on, and not also being overwhelmed by all of it. You know, the whole point of working with fear, as we're going to see to the conclusion of this, is to increase our courage and our bravery. That's the real purpose of fear underneath all of it, our bravery and our courage to work with these concepts about dedicating myself to the welfare of all beings, about continuing to develop myself so I can eventually benefit others in that. This is the best use of fear, to actually induce deeper feelings of compassion and connection to others. Because once more, we're not alone in our fear. Many beings are going through the same thing. And then, as His Holiness says in concluding on that part of it, he says, even though you are opening yourself to greater suffering, taking greater suffering to yourself, your fear lessens. This technique of taking and giving, Tonglen, as many of you know, it involves visualizing, taking on the fear, the pain, the suffering of others, taking it on ourselves and giving them our happiness. I'd go into more detail on that, but we're just not having so much time. The final way that we can work with it in terms of the more common teachings of the Buddha is, as His Holiness says there, to investigate who is becoming afraid. Examine the nature of yourself. Where is this I? Who is I? What is the nature of the I? Is there an I besides my physical body and my consciousness? He said this may help. I mean, this again is a deeper investigation. Those of you who've been around Buddhist teachings on emptiness, you know, may be able to use that as a technique to say, well, where is the source of this fear? As I was explaining earlier, we think there's this real concrete I here. That doesn't exist at all. If we can do that deeper investigation, a lot of the fear falls away because we realize that it's been revolving once more around that concrete sense of a self. Again, in terms of that may help ourselves, in terms of others, we still need to keep that compassion, that concern, because most beings, again, don't have access to that awareness. They aren't living from that place of that understanding or realization. Even ourselves, we struggle with it in terms of deepening it. The last thing I might just point out really quickly is that even in Tantra, we have techniques. Buddhist Tantra in Tibetan Buddhism is one of the main staples of our practice. Tibetan Buddhism offers many methods. This is from an article about what green Tara can teach us about fear. This wonderful being, this female Buddha, who is about liberating from fears. So methods for recognizing, overcoming, and ending disturbing emotions, including fear. And some are grounded in awareness of the body. Of course, in Tantric Buddhism, there's very much an integration of the subtle body that we have with our spiritual practice. So green Tara, who represents the aspect of a Buddha that protects us from fear, also represents the energy winds of the body and breath. And if you learn some of these deeper tantric techniques, you can reduce so much of the fear through utilizing that. But just bringing to mind green Tara, who has this ability to, again, calm our minds through working with the winds and so on, can be very, very healing. Tara's influence is the capacity to act, to move through life and accomplish our aims. Indeed, her name means she who ferries across, she who takes us to that kind of fearless state. So this is green Tara. Got a hunk of green Tara somewhere in here. I can't see it right now over there. Yeah. Anyway, that's her mantra, Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Soha. Again, there are many practices you can do with Tara. We have occasionally offer things here where people can do that practice. So let me talk a little bit about fearlessness just in the last minutes I have here. So I think it is important that, as I said earlier, we understand that fearlessness comes from fear. And I love the way Chogyam Trungpa points this out. He says the logic is quite simple. You might ask, for example, why someone takes a shower. Well, why do you take a shower? Because you feel dirty. The dirt is what really makes you want to clean up. Similarly, fearlessness comes from fear, right? You can't have fearlessness without fear. Fear is this natural thing, again, that's going to arise that we can learn from. We don't always have to have it. And sometimes it may be neurotic and something we can dismantle. But nonetheless, if it is in our lives, we can actually become fearless in the face of it. Pema Chodron says to be fearless isn't really to overcome fear, it's to come to know its nature. And I hope that some of what I've gone through today has helped you to do that. Then the Dalai Lama, this is a book the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and Douglas Abrams did. This is actually Douglas Abrams talking here, but I'm going to end on this. One of my favorite quotes he says that we included in Nelson Mandela's book, Notes to the Future, was on courage. And the quote was, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I felt fear more times than I can remember, but I hid it behind a mask of boldness. The brave person is not that person who does not feel afraid, but the one who conquers that fear. Right? So again, fearlessness requires fear. Archbishop Tutu also said something similar. He said, courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. I think even Mark Twain said something very similar. So we essentially have, this kind of ability to use our fear to increase our courageous response to the world, our courageous compassion, our courageous wisdom, so that we then are in a better place to act. So anyway, I hope some of what I offer gives you some tools. Again, there's many more things that I could point out in regard to Buddhism, but the goal is to eventually become fearless, but we do have to work with what fear can teach us. It's again, a very common emotion, but one that has a deeper lesson. So any questions or comments on what I've talked about? Criticism, I'm open to criticisms too.
Christina, you asked if Gen Don could put up the 8 worldly concerns. Do you still need that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
And Anna is asking if there is access to these slides.
Yes, what I will do, I generally have provide them to Venerable Dundrup and then put them out on a drive. Yeah. So what Venerable Dundrup is saying is if you were to go back to this class on the calendar and just go to the page where you probably entered if you're on Zoom today, or those in the Gompa, you just go to that page and it will have a link to course materials that Venerable Dundrup kindly does that. So we do have, I'm sorry, there is.
And there is a green Tara meditation coming up on Tuesday, April 8th at 5 p.m. It will be on Zoom, led by our wonderful Mary Mogenberg, of course.
Thanks for letting me know that. Yeah, I didn't look up ahead of time where we might be offering practice
And
every 3 weeks.
Mary also asks, Mary Mogenberg asks if we could please dedicate this class to Bobby Paul's mother, who passed on March 30th.
So we'll do that as part of the dedications. Any other final questions or comments? Yes, please, Makan.
When you and I were having tea, you came up with a really good sort of a quote
Okay.
from a movie. What was that movie called about the hotel?
Gosh, you're going to put me on the spot to remember something.
I am, yeah. No more notes, Dawn.
And it was about a hotel.
That was the movie, and then there was a quote about the way things always work out.
Oh, it's the.
I think it's Hotel Rwanda. Is it? Hotel
No, it's
Rwanda?
the exotic Marigold Hotel.
Oh, that one. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, there's that quote that's in there. Something about I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact words, and I did with you as well when I mentioned it. It had to do with oh, things always work out in the end. If they haven't worked out, then it's not the end. I mean, one of the things that I might restructure this talk in the future. I was thinking this when I was putting today's talk together because I try to review it and refresh things and maybe figure out how I might want to approach it based on the times that we're in. But I think we have this concept of hope and fear. These come together, right? Even in that wonderful Christmas song, the hopes and fears of all hopes and fears. I mean, but these are really kind of, they can become distorted. Hope in itself has a good element to it, right? Because it has a positive movement forward. But hope can also become very delusional, right? And so I think there's sometimes where, we have to watch that, where we say, oh, it'll all work out in the end, just thinking that somehow magically things are going to happen. Hope can be a very powerful force if we make it more active. This is what Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston do in their book called Active Hope. Their teachings about how to deal with the environmental crisis we're going through, the climate change and what have you, is you don't just sit there and say, oh, I hope someone takes care of this. That's not going to get you there, that kind of hope. Hope can be very positive and powerful if it becomes active, if you actually say, what can I do about it? So I didn't want to emphasize that as much today in the talk, but please know that I'm not saying by any means we just sit on our cushion and do our work on dealing with our own fear in our own minds and don't be out there trying to do what we can to address what's going on in our world. And I mentioned some of these ways of being more politically active, but you can also just simply volunteer, help out, be an extra body at whatever agency needs it. A lot of agencies are dealing with huge cuts to their funds because of everything that's happening. And donations are going to dry up because people are going to feel less flexible with their money, right? Because the economy is tanking or whatever. All of this is going to be happening. So again, try to be in the world with that sense of more hope and to try to confront the fear that is out there. But don't just sit there and, I mean, that phrase almost makes it sound like, again, somebody else is going to make it all happen. It's all going to be, once it's the end, then it will have worked out. Well, no, we have to also be active agents in that. So, yeah, thank you. I did remember it. Just took me a minute. Let's go ahead and conclude. Sorry, I've gone a bit over again, as I'm tending to do. Let's once more think about dedicating. We'll put the dedication prayers on. We can specifically dedicate. Bobby Falls was a student here for many years, and she's in New Orleans, living in New Orleans now. She came up to visit not that long ago, but hearing of her mother's passing, we can dedicate for her mother to have perfect rebirth, all the conditions she needs to find happiness, both temporally and ultimately. And we can also dedicate in our own minds for those beings that we're holding in our hearts, and kind of dedicating with this sense of giving that positive energy so those beings can be free of the suffering that they're going through and find once more the causes that lead to true peace and happiness. Then we can universalize this out of just those beings that we're more specifically concerned with to reciting this prayer from Master Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, the text I quoted from earlier. Let's recite this together. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and There we go. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments, whatever diseases there are in the world. May they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. We can dedicate for His Holiness's long life and His wishes to be fulfilled. And as we recite this, think that we're also creating the causes for all of our gurus, teachers who are still with us to have those same results. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. We have a short dedication then for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation to appear swiftly. Next Sunday is actually the anniversary, 2 years since his passing. So I'm going to try to cut the class short. We'll do just an additional set of prayers for his swift return. But it's very important that we create the causes from our side to have Rinpoche back in a form where we can benefit from him in a physical form. So thank you all for coming today. Again, be of comfort to each other during this time too. Community is so important. Don't discount the importance of that in your life. Isolating ourselves from others is not a good thing. So try to be with others, not necessarily always people who are like-minded. I'll talk about that in 2 weeks when I go into bridging our differences. How are we dealing with people who are not thinking the same way as us, whatever your particular political persuasion is? But know that, again, rely on each other. These are always times where we need to come together with more unity and community. So thank you.